Everybody, how you doing? Marc Ross, Friday, September 15th, Ructions podcast, probably the best podcast in the world. What do you think, Gerald Ashley?
Absolutely right. I see you're riffing off Carlsberg there straight away. Normally at the top of our little show, we talk about what's going on, and I'm just waiting to be terrified by COVID again. We've got through August, and we've been terrified by weather maps that would suggest we were all going to fry and never make it to September. And now all of a sudden, it's all about whether COVID's back. People should be having another jab. Some people are advocating wearing masks. I think that's a very, very tiny minority view at the moment. And some suitably irrelevant politician from Scotland is already talking about another lockdown. I mean, good grief. And I just wonder if this is going to become, in the same way as August is a silly season, is September going to be the pre-flu scare stories season? It certainly feels like it this September.
I actually know more people in my network that have gotten COVID in the last few weeks than, there's been a lull, and it does seem to be back. I actually myself, I'm going to get the flu COVID shot this afternoon just for the hell of it. I don't know. I mean, something's happening, but the buzz, the interest, I'm seeing a lot more masks, especially around DC. But it's like a chilling effect. I don't know, but it's something we're going to have to live with and deal with. And I don't know why there needs to be such anxiety about it. I mean, it just seems like this is something we got to mitigate and do. But the media the media really tends to make things exciting these days. Everything is a crisis with the media.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, we've gone through scorching hot weather maps. North Korea has still failed to start World War III. So we now need to move on, and here comes COVID.
It does seem to the media, it's so global now. It just picks up these random stories in the most random parts of the world that we never would have heard of before. And, they're becoming national news stories overnight. And I don't know. That's a whole separate commentary, but there's something weird going on with the news, I think.
Well, I think a lot of it's to do with attention seeking as well, because if you go back to the golden age of television broadcast news in the 60s, 70s, and even 80s, it was pretty much a monopoly game, or it was a very small number of players. I mean, it was considered shock horror when CNN suddenly appeared. I'm going to get the year wrong, but it's very late 70s, early 80s, isn't it, with Ted Turner? And there'd been this sort of monopoly on news. Now these guys are fighting for attention from everybody from one end of the spectrum as close competitors down to even guys like us doing sort of commentary stuff. And so it's all become about clicks and attention and immediacy. And immediacy doesn't really lend itself to considered thought, I don't think.
So here in the States, Meet the Press is the longest running television news program. It's on NBC News. It's been on for 76 seasons. So I don't know what the math is on that. I mean, I don't even know when television started, but it seems that Meet the Press was there. Anyways, there's a new host. Chuck Todd has moved on. Kristen Welker's starting this weekend. And guess who her first guest is?
I'm not good on these, but let's go for Hillary. Is it Hillary?
Well, that's a good one. It's Donald Trump, right? So she's like, how do we get the buzz? How do we create the energy? Like, who do we go for? The apex monster himself. Yeah. So even one of the most respected news programs in the world, arguably, right? The gold standard of television Sunday public affairs shows is going with the Trumpster to create the buzz. I mean, it's like, it's so what? And of course he said, yeah, I'll do it. I love it.
And I'm maybe going to be deeply unfair here, but I don't think this is going to be a deep, penetrating series of interview questions.
Well, they may be penetrating and interesting, but the Trumpster is like no other politician that I know of. He'll make it a show. I mean, he knows it's all about the ratings, baby, right?
I imagine a lot of it will be about Hunter Biden's billions or some nonsense or whatever. Who knows? But okay. Well, we wait and see. But
here's the thing we should monitor too. I would suspect, I mean, for sure to get news coverage global, he'll make headlines and it'll be on our papers on Sunday on both sides of the Atlantic. So something to look forward to.
Good for NBC's ratings.
Exactly. And with probably little other than buzz and clicks, very little substance. But I don't know. Maybe
There'll be
Trump
what,
will
two or
release a
three.
10-point plan to change the world. Maybe that's
There'll be
will
kind of
happen.
there'll be two or three 12-second clips that make it to the headline news, won't there? Basically.
So you've been warned, dear visitors. All right, let's speak of somebody else who's getting a lot of buzz. Tony Blair, number 10 whisperer in rating. This guy, he's 70 years old, which is interesting because all the leadership in America seems to be in their late 70s. Tony is younger in his early 70s, so I don't know, maybe that's a good age. I've been thinking about this. I think he's probably would be a better prime minister today than he was when he was prime minister because he actually knows the job. But there he is. He's building the coalition. He's getting the team back together. Tony Blair, is he the next prime minister? Yes or no?
No, no, but that doesn't mean he won't be running the country. I'm reminded, and this is a very oblique reference to a English chronicler, history chronicler from the 800s, called Geoffrey of Monmouth, and he wrote a book about King Arthur called The Once and Future King, and it's quite a famous book. And is Tony Blair the once and future king? Well, probably, or certainly once king and future kingmaker. And how has all this happened? Well, basically, the Labour Party, I suppose, depending on your point of view, has moved more to the centre. Starmer has sort of gone to his natural ground, which is quite a long way away from the antics of Comrade Corbyn and all the rest of it. But you see, the Labour Party have been out of power since 2010. And so they're actually quite thin on the ground in terms of people who've got any direct government experience. I mean, obviously, would have been around 14 years and still be around now. So a lot of people who are around in the Gordon Brown administration have moved on or, shuffled off elsewhere. And here's Tony Blair arrives on the scene with this sort of flat pack of ready-made sort of IKEA politicians and advisors who will just literally, like IKEA, will suddenly pop up. Now, the most extraordinary thing about all of this is the scale of the operation. There's quite a good article, unfortunately it's behind a paywall, by an online magazine called The Critic, about the Tony Blair Institute. And I was slightly on the floor when I read that he has 800 people working for him. This isn't a guy with a chauffeur and a good Rolodex of names to be able to go and do a few TV shows. I mean, this is a major industry. I mean, can you just imagine the annual salary bill of 800 people? So it's a big money operation. And I guess we watch this space. Starmer, I imagine, will be a little bit nervous of being too closely aligned to that because he's got to keep the Labour Party on side. But the general feeling this side of the pond is that the next general election is a done deal. You will know better than me. That's often a dangerous place to be in. But I mean, the lead is so extraordinary. And despite there having to be very large swings, I think it's hard to see that Starmer doesn't get in. Now, whether he'll have a slim majority or a landslide, who knows? But the interesting thing is, where's he going to take his advice from? And as I say, suddenly Tony Blair's back on the pitch.
Yeah, there's three things I think are interesting. So here in the States, and I don't know if this is a new development in the UK, but that what you mentioned, the 800 employees, right, are connected to the Tony Blair Institute. Here in the States, we've got different think tanks, like say Heritage Foundation on the right, or American Enterprise Institute, or on the left, Center for American Progress. They're essentially governments in waiting, right? They work for an administration. They still have the passion. Maybe they don't sell out to a corporation, so they go to these think tanks. And they're governments in waiting, right? They're literally on the circuit talking about how horrible the current administration is, and they're just waiting to get back in. It does seem like the Tony Blair Institute has kind of filled that gap.
Yeah.
But Blair's press is unbelievable, and it's by design, obviously. Like this, none of this stuff happens by accident. and couching all these ideas. There was an interview in the FT that going on about the even supporting some of Dominic Cummings' ideas about the bureaucracy and the civil service needing that to reform. As I say, Blair probably knows. I guarantee he knows how to do the job better now than he did when he actually had the job. He's had more time to think
Well,
about it.
of
He's much more
course,
worldly,
yeah,
and you would think that would help Steimer, right?
yeah, and you must remember that when Blair became prime minister, he'd never had any role in government at all. He'd not even been the lowest sort of junior minister, so he did arrive, at the top job. But I think there are a number of differences this time around, and one of the differences that tends to be forgotten without making too much of a partisan point is that when Blair arrived in '97, Britain's finances were in pretty good shape. They had been poor until the Chancellor Kenneth Clarke came in and basically did that unpopular thing of tax more and spend less, and probably may have contributed to the Tories losing the '97 election. But the finances are in pretty good shape. And they stayed pretty much in good shape until Blair's second administration, when they sort of cut loose and started spending money like water. Now, this time, we are in a completely different situation. I mean, I haven't done my homework. I'd have to go away and check the numbers. But the amount of debt interest we are paying now
Yeah.
in the UK is, I think I'm right in saying, well north of the defence budget. So we are actually paying more interest out in quarterly interest payments um, to bondholders than we are to keep our armed forces on the go. Now that is a huge constraint, but it's not the biggest constraint, because it's not about money, as we know, because this money doesn't really exist anyhow. It's about creditworthiness, and the creditworthiness issue is what hit both the Labour and Tory administrations in the early '70s, when they were unable to keep raising more debt. They couldn't sell more bonds. There was something slightly arcane. It was called the gilt strike. Gilts being UK government bonds, and investors said, actually, we just don't want them. Now, we're not in that situation now, but I think it's worth suggesting that if Starmer thinks he can go in and throw money at it, or more precisely, throw more borrowed money at things, he's in for a rude awakening, because the situation is different. So it's like everything in life, things go around in cycles, and there are lots of similarities, but there are also big differences. And I think this debt thing is kind of a big issue.
No, the debt, and also just the world's much more complex. Obviously, you get the rise of the global south, what's going on with Russia, Ukraine, China, North Korea. I mean, it doesn't have the go-go energy, right, of the kind of internet boom, right, that we all enjoyed when Clinton and Blair are around. So that is also interesting. I think what the Keir Steimer thing is so interesting as well. I don't know if you saw this, but he's skipping off to France. He's got a meeting with Macron, which is interesting to say the least. And apparently, the good leader of the Labour Party is going to be in Canada in the coming days or coming weeks. And there's rumors like, is he going to meet with Trudeau? So even the rest of the world, is rolling out the red carpet to meet presumably the next prime minister of the United Kingdom. It's pretty wild stuff to think that an election is a year away and that Rishi Sunak, is just going to be pushed to the sidelines. That's also an interesting development. I mean, I guess the strategy is to delay the election as long as humanly possible until the numbers improve. But the rest of the world, publicly, the media, leadership, everybody is kind of saying,
Yeah,
let's get on to the new guy. I mean, what do you think about that?
well, I think you can sometimes look at people's actions rather than their words. And as you say, Starmer is going around, um, trying to meet world leaders and all the rest of it, which he seems to be having some success at doing. Um, and our Prime Minister is agonising over a new breed of dangerous dog. Now, dogs can be dangerous, they can kill, but do they really merit a 2-minute interview on headline news as a new government policy? Um, I mean, this suggests, defeatism of the, you know, I mean, we're rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, right? I mean, this is not long-term policy. It's nothing at all. And I think the Tory government are repeating what we've seen so many times before in British administrations, is they kind of give up on big picture stuff, and then they get bogged down in the minutiae of the mechanics of government, and then they blame civil servants because it's not doing what they say they would do. The classic phrase to look out for is when commentators say that the prime minister is very frustrated because he pulls at the levers and nothing seems to happen in the machine. Now, we heard that under Harold Wilson, Jim Callaghan, maybe not Mrs. Thatcher, certainly John Major, certainly Gordon Brown. That was his entire prime ministership. And again, the hapless Mrs. May, and well, Boris is a special case. But there's a pattern here. For followers of pattern, one last point, of course, is when Sir Keir Starmer does win, or if he does win, within hours they will announce that the finances and the books look far worse than they expected. This again has been a traditional ceremony almost since the Second World War.
When the real books are presented, right, to the prime minister, of course.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing about the current leadership. Even I see the Biden team do that. Like they're very wrapped around airline fees, or these hidden fees around ticketing, like really small ball. Like I don't know why the hell the president is worried about the price of concert tickets, but clearly it's polling well. They pissed off suburban people, so they're going to talk about it. But you're leading one of the greatest nations in the world, and to be thinking about the breed of pets that is allowed suggests desperation in my mind. But anyways,
there's a much bigger pet problem actually, which was a magazine article last week suggesting that certainly in Britain that pets are a large part of our carbon emissions problem. Without going into too much detail, but not just so much what comes out one end, but the fact that all the processed food they eat. So cats and dogs in this country are ginormous eaters of fish and meat. And apparently this is not environmentally sound. So there we are.
Unbelievable. As you know, the only emissions that matter are car emissions. The rest of it is nonsense. Anyways, let's speak about Ukraine. Very interesting. A lot going on. Zelenskyy is on his way to DC this week. Also, the Ukrainians very successfully doing some military activities using cruise missiles to destroy Russian Navy ships in the Black Sea. Very exciting. Boris Johnson out with the column today in The Spectator saying we need more weapons. Biden promising, I don't know, another $25 billion. I think the U.S. is already in for $100 billion. What's going on? Ukraine. Oh, and by the way, we should remind viewers, while this is going on, Putin is on the other side of the world, meeting with our dear leader, Kim Jong-un, begging North Korea for more weapons. Wow, this seems like the Ukrainian war is fits and starts, but there's no end in sight, is what I say. But there's more gear going into the theater.
I think maybe it's become a sort of standard mantra on this little show. We say, oh, it's kind of trench warfare, First World War. It'll advance 5 miles one way and then 5 miles the other. And I think that's still broadly true. But the next factor that I think is coming in, and maybe why there's all this heightened activity and lobbying of the press and lobbying of politicians and all the rest of it, is our dear friend the weather. Now, okay, we're in September, but that part of the world does get very heavy rainfall, and that is going to bog down ground operations, which may be why there's more emphasis on cruise missiles, drones, and all the rest of it. Well, drones have been big anyhow. But I think it's also instructive that we don't hear very much about the much vaunted German Leopard tanks or the British Challenger tanks, how these were going to be game changers. They clearly aren't. There's been some fairly small press reports showing that quite a few German tanks have been destroyed. And I think one, if not two, of the British ones. We're only talking about very low numbers. So I'm going to kind of stick to my view that this is just going to just rumble on. and that the geopolitics is the Americans will do just enough to stop the Ukrainians being defeated, but they don't want to get into an escalated war, which goes right up to the Russian border or even over it. They don't want to go anywhere near that, and it may be a bit Machiavellian or cynical. I just wonder if we'll be having this conversation the other side of a very cold winter. And then I think Zelensky's challenge will be, can he energize Western leaders, more specifically in the United States, as you absolutely hit the electoral cycle? And then I don't know if I'm misreading what's going on, but the one and only Donald Trump seems to be far less keen on a lot of this sort of arming of Ukraine than maybe the Democrat side, but time will tell.
Yeah, so a few points. As I told you before we came on air, I was at an event last night at the British ambassador's residency, and she was talking about, she's got a lot of experience working with the Soviets. She's probably been a diplomat for like 40 years now, but she was saying like Putin is not a Soviet, he's a Russian, which was very interesting. And she made it like two, I think, points that coincide with what you're thinking as well. I mean, she said, could I see a truce happening between Russia and Ukraine? She could, but she couldn't see lasting peace, right? That is, there could be a truce, but within 8, 10, 15 years, the Russians will be back trying to take back Ukraine. So how we get out of it. She also made an interesting point that most conflicts involving the great powers, they were actually participants, right? We're actually on the battlefield, boots on the field, etc. This conflict, as of now, the great powers they're spectators, they're providing material, intelligence, but they aren't sending blood and treasure directly into the field. So she was like, I don't know how this ends. Like, she was almost throwing her hands up because there's no like pathway out, even if there's quote unquote a truce. It doesn't really mean anything. So
Yeah,
that also plays into it. And then, sorry, but the domestic politics in the States, as I said, we've dropped maybe $100 billion, could be more, who knows. At the core, the U.S. is very isolationist anyways. This is a good opportunity to talk about endless wars, etc. It kind of plays into the populism, the politics, etc. Most people don't even know where Ukraine is in the United States. So all this is coming together, and to have nations saying, yeah, there's no pathway out of this, the most senior leadership, wow, not a good situation for Zelenskyy, Ukrainians, or even the Russians.
There are a couple of past examples of this, and I suppose the frightening parallel is the armistice as it was after the First World War, and then 20 years later the whole thing blew up again with even worse consequences. And maybe the best one can hope for is something a bit like the split between North and South Korea.
Yeah, which is still active conflict, quote unquote. Yeah. I mean, they don't have a peace treaty per se. It's just an armistice.
But there's just this sort of status quo that has kind of gradually grown. And, I mean, maybe the problem here is I think a lot of the West, understandably, and I guess I feel like this a bit, see this war as a moral thing. That the Russians have just turned up and just started flattening everybody and killing everybody. But that's not normally the way sort of realpolitik works. It's not about the morality of the situation. It's about the reality of the situation. And one of the realities of the situation is that the eastern part of Ukraine is dare one say, quite pro-Russian. I mean, when one looked at the voting patterns before this all blew up, in other words, pre-Crimea in 2014, there was a dramatic split between East and West Ukraine as to whether, the West wanted to climb into bed with NATO and join EU and was facing that way, and the East very much not so. So there may be a de facto sort of natural split, and it may come to that because it's the least worst option for both sides.
And you're spot on. I mean, there's a high reason why in 2014, when the Russians went into Crimea and whatnot, that the West was like, okay, like this isn't a core constituency. Yeah. Kiev is different. Spot on. I also just thought about this, like the fact that the Ukrainians sank some major boats ships, if you will, the Black Sea Fleet and the Russians. Zelenskyy coming to town next week in D.C. I would not be surprised if there's going to be some kind of theatrics, very dramatic show of force from the Russians. Putin coming back to Moscow. I can't imagine he's too pleased that cruise missiles sunk part of his fleet there in the Black Sea. I don't know. Next week could be pretty interesting.
Yeah, again, once again, we're in violent agreement. One thing to say about the Russian Black Sea Fleet, it's a bit clapped out. It's not exactly. You remember the first ship? Was it the Moskva or whatever it was that was actually sunk? Well, it was either that or going to the breakers yard, and so this is not a first-class navy they've got. Certainly not in the Black Sea. They have much better assets elsewhere, but there again, it's pretty mixed. There's a very famous piece of film of a Russian aircraft carrier trundling through the English Channel about 5 or 6 years ago, and it barely had the strength to make it home. So, I mean, again, this is the slightly lopsided situation with Russian armed forces. I think of all the three Russian forces, the Navy's the weakest. But of course, it is important for the Ukrainians to demonstrate that and all the rest of it. But well, we shall see. But as I say, I'll just finish with this thought that we'll be having exactly this conversation next April.
No, I agree. And I think, like, just from a behavioral economic standpoint, Russia and Ukraine are locked in. There's no exit ramp. This is a very dire situation. The West, politically, how much more money can they spend? How much more politics, etc., can they exhaust on this? Maybe even the media coverage next week won't have the same bravo that it did when Zelenskyy came here, I guess, back in December. There's a bit of exhaustion. So,
yeah, it's a
I don't
problem.
know. Not a great situation.
It's a very difficult thing for anybody to manage, and it's your skill set, isn't it? The PR management. How do you make Zelenskyy seem vital and important without people saying, "Oh yeah, we heard all this 6 months ago"? It's difficult.
No, you're spot on. Like, from a comm standpoint, it'll be. I'm super interested to see what he can say to make this a greater cause, and then just to have him presence just in DC. I don't know if that really helps him. Obviously, going further afield. But yeah, how does he reframe the story? How does he re-energize it? Huge challenge. And when you're dealing with somebody as irrational as Putin, who isn't playing by the rules, if you will, if he's playing by a different skill set, I don't know, quite a conundrum for sure.
Indeed.
So that's all we have on that. All right, let's talk about our favorite company in the world, Apple. They released a new iPhone, big announcement. We're going to follow up on this. We were talking about the price point, I guess, on our pod 2 weeks ago. Two things I think are interesting about Apple. One of them is that the USB port, which is the device to charge, etc., forced upon them by the European Union. A good reminder that geopolitics and the European Union always find a way to, get involved with business models. And also this push around carbon neutrality, etc. We were chatting, 1984, Ridley Scott, Revolution, George Orwell, leading the charge. And now we have Apple in this cocoon of safety, not being rebellious. It's taking a generation. I don't know. They've kind of lost their buzz, and they're sitting, I think, on like $62 billion in cash. And their big announcement was a new charging port and to buy carbon neutral watches, which I think probably already exist. But
yeah, God knows what that is.
What's your advice for Apple? I mean, are they just stuck in the quagmire? Are they afraid to be bold? What happened to Apple?
Maybe they're too big to succeed. I mean, they've kind of got, if I had $62 billion, I don't think I'd get out of bed very early in the morning. I don't know how Wall Street views this, but I'm surprised there haven't been calls for them to actually do some serious distribution to shareholders.
Yeah.
And I don't mean the usual game of buying some stock, which keeps the price up, so the executives sitting pretty on their stock options. But how about returning $25 billion in cash and just, letting people get on with it? And that, from an economics point of view, would be quite interesting as to whether it would be a stimulation into the economy or not, because presumably the $65 billion is sitting around in treasury bills and banked it
Yeah, I
full.
guess on the it's called cash and cash equivalents, right? So
Yeah. No, it's not all in greenbacks, but I mean, interestingly, if you distributed it to shareholders, a lot of whom would be corporates themselves, would there be a large number of individuals, um, not least of which Warren Buffett would be one. But a lot of that may just sort of feed through into spending and the economy in general. So
you just
that hasn't been thought of. But Apple,
no, by being I just thought of something. By being so big, like, and sitting on so much cash, like in some ways, I imagine leadership team is being presented with just a bevy of, like, almost being overwhelmed by choices, right? Because if you're a staffer at Apple or any kind of entrepreneur, you see that cash and you're like, hey, Tim Cook, I've got 10 ways you can spend this money. You wonder if they're so big now and they've got so much opportunity, they could literally go anywhere they want, that they're being overwhelmed by choice.
yeah, I'm always worried about people, institutions when they get that big. There's a great book which I think I may have plugged on this show before by a British economist called Paul Ormrod, which is called uh, Everything Fails, I think it was, or Everything Fails Eventually, something like that. So then I have to look up the precise title. Or is it Why Everything Fails? Essentially, he's saying that institutions, whether they're corporates, the church, local government, any form of government, has got a natural life cycle to it. And certainly, we can think of enormous corporate names in the past that just don't exist anymore, or only a fraction of the size that they were. And it's even some big tech big boys, like where the hell is Cisco these days? And showing my age, and I would have been quite young, but the biggest computer company in the world in the 1960s was not IBM, it was Fairchild. Well, that doesn't trip off the tongue anymore. And so I think however big you are doesn't mean eventually you can't get, caught out. And the problem I think you have when you're so big and so perceived to be powerful that, as you say, you almost are stuck. You don't know what to do with a big idea. So you are down to, oh, let's put a fifth camera on the phone or whatever the next wildly exciting idea is going to be. Maybe these products have reached their natural, their natural state in the marketplace. I mean, I'm famously not a tech geek, but I cannot understand why people race out every year to get, Apple phone 12, 13, 14, and 15. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. And I just wonder how much longer that will go on. I mean, I could have said this 5 years ago and I would look incredibly stupid because this continues to be the case. But they're not exactly doing anything very earth shattering as a firm. And perhaps the capital could be better used doing other things, maybe in other hands.
No, the more I think about this, in the same week as the rollout happens, the Chinese, there's stories that they're forcing Chinese bureaucrats not to use Apple phones, right? So that's a market that's super important to China. Also this week, one of the French authorities said the iPhone 12 is emitting too much radiation, which that is going to, like, spread across Europe. What do the French know that the Germans don't know? That, and I can already
That
see,
was
like,
interesting. That was
I can already
interesting. Yeah, because do you not recall 5 or maybe 10 years ago now, there was this huge scare that if you used your phone too much, radio waves were going to fry your brain and there'd be brain cancer and all the rest of it. And then it just sort of died and went away.
Well,
Um,
apparently, yeah, but I guess it's a software fix that they can fix internally. Like, this happens from time to time. But to me, because there's so much cash there, energy, like, there's going to be trial attorneys that are like, what's going on here, right? Putting that capital to use, like, you would imagine if Apple went to the French and said, hey, we're going to spend $500 million and build a new tech facility, you wouldn't have this kind of pressure, right? So Apple being too big is going to be a huge challenge. People are going to want that money, and they're going to want them to do something interesting.
yeah, do you know, isn't this actually a plug for myself here? I wrote a book about this, the difference between disruptive and incremental change. And disruptive change is exactly what Apple was when in its very early days, or even going back to people like Hewlett Packard, when it was Mr. Hewlett and Mr. Packard. And then over time, with success, you become more and more incremental. And we're down to, I mean, look at the car or auto industry pre EVs before that, what was new? It was the color of the car, or the fact you could have, electrically heated wing mirrors and all. I mean, this is all trivial stuff. It's not the big disruptive change. It's not the big disruptive change of Frau Frau Deutz or Frau Benz, wasn't it? Driving 20 miles in a car that was thought to be the first one ever, but also a death trap. Um, that was a disruptive change. But, you know, when's the next fascinating Apple incremental change announcement coming? Probably in another year's time. And I mean, okay, do it the other way around. Who can remember the one from 4 times ago? What was
Well,
really,
that would have been the Apple 11, the iPhone
yeah,
11.
what was so exciting about that? You know,
So let's make it interesting. Let's make a prediction. What do you think happens to Apple in the next, I don't know, should we say 12 months, 24 months?
I think they roll on, and cynics and wise guys like me will be proven wrong because they're such a machine that they can continue to keep going for a very long time. But management now is not about managing the product; it's about managing the political space in which they operate. And so they're absolutely front and center in any issue to do with China, as we know. Um, and the thing where I keep being caught out is that um, their ability to generate premium sales is astonishing. Whether, and we don't know we'll get one, but if we do get a US recession, maybe we'll see how recession proof they are. They may then have a couple of bad years. I think what's more likely to happen is that they're so busy lobbying and doing all the political stuff, they will miss the next big disruptive change. Um, and maybe it's in something different. It may not be in electronics, you see. Maybe it'll be in biology, maybe it'll be in pharma or somewhere slightly different. And so it may be not a space they can necessarily get involved in, or would be very much an outsider. But trees don't grow to the sky, and to me, they've reached a hell of a size. Um, and the lessons from the past is that even the most enormous companies in the world shrivel. I mean, you think of the U.S. Steel, Bethlehem Steel, the
Yeah.
huge great companies, the huge great railroads from 100 years ago. Um, they're not the same beasts anymore. Quite a few oil companies around, but in a way they almost are the exception that breaks the rule. But no doubt I shall be wrong when we talk about this in a year's time. But to me, they've run out of road slightly. But
Yeah, I think there's gonna be more pressure, yeah, from governments for them to like deploy that capital, more pressure from investors. I don't know, maybe even break up. They should, and they've such a halo effect. I mean, they're such a well-respected company. It does seem like they get serious about pharma, energy, automotive. They could go into that space. I don't know, but it just
but
seems like they're playing such small ball.
yeah, the lessons of trying to create those conglomerates is not happy. I mean, one thinks back to the days of somebody like Harold Janine and ITT, and they thought they would invest in everything that moves, or Gulf and Western. Those sort of guys who thought we've got so much money we can throw it at anything. Um, in the end, they throw a lot of it away, which maybe, in fairness to Apple, is why they're just kind of sitting on it. They're saying we don't know what to do with it, but we're not going to fritter it away.
Well, it's definitely a space to watch. It's interesting. There's a theme too, like Rishi Sunak, Joe Biden, Tim Cook. They're all playing like a bit small, right? Like the dog issue, the pricing issue here in the States, rolling out little features, um, where there's other kind of the disruptive forces in the world, the Kim Jong-uns, Putin, they're totally crazy. So I don't know. There's like we're lacking kind of a sensible middle, but Trumpster, all these wild card leaders, and you got guys like Tim Cook, Rishi Sunak, who do seem to be the same guy, right? Playing
Yeah,
small ball. I don't know.
in the nicest possible way, and I'm not suggesting I'm any different. They're middle managers. I mean, Rishi Sunak is a classic middle manager, and he's got those big strategy, but he issues enormous numbers of detailed pieces of information that nobody's remotely interested in. I do read articles, and who knows how true they are, that he is immensely hardworking. that he is at his desk 12, 14 hours a day. And that may be part of the problem. You can't spend all, you cannot run the world with a spreadsheet.
That's a good quote, man. That should be on a bumper sticker.
I
Gerald
better,
Ashley, 2024.
I better go out and copyright.
Are you announcing your campaign now? All right, let's finish up with what we're reading and watching. Do you want to go first?
Yes, and it's going to be one of your pet topics. We're back on sport and we're back on soft power.
Love
And
it.
this time it's rugby union, which has always been my favourite sport. I certainly played quite a lot of it at school. And it's not the game it was when I played as a lad. It's much more professional. It's of a higher standard. It's got one or two problems because the physical damage it's doing to players. These guys are so big and crashing into one another at 15 miles an hour or even 20 miles an hour. What the hell they're doing? They're not just hurting one another; they're damaging one another. That said, it's the Rugby Union World Cup, which is it's quite an interesting World Cup, maybe in the same way as the soccer, in that there's the established sort of aristocracy of about maybe 10 countries around the world. And within that sort of first division, there's a lot of rivalry between the North and South hemispheres. It's generally accepted that Australia and particularly New Zealand and South Africa have tended to play the higher standard of game probably over the last 50 years. And Northern Hemisphere, sort of England, France, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, etc., have tended to lag a little bit behind. But what does make it interesting is the sort of second division players. So players that are starting to nibble into the first division. So one thinks of teams like Argentina, who've had quite a good run in previous competitions, maybe even Romania, Japan, which people used to laugh and sneer at Japan because without stating the obvious, they were kind of little guys, and this is at least half a team needs to be huge. But the quality of play of the Japanese has been impressive, and they seem to continue to grow. So it's a very interesting competition. And to your point about sort of soft power and everything, this is France's opportunity to show that they can run an international tournament and it'll all run very smoothly. It has done. There's been a tiny niggle about queuing to get into the first England game, but that's probably well that it happens now rather than when it's further into the competition. And I just wonder if the French authorities see this as a little bit of a dry run for the Olympics next year, in that it's the whole feel of how they can showcase France and France's involvement and importance in the sporting stage, etc., etc. So,
yeah, for sure. It's definitely, it's got to be playing in the minds of the Olympics. 2024, Paris.
So,
oh my gosh.
No doubt Monsieur Macron will have a photo opportunity of presenting the cup in a few weeks' time. And I'm not going to give any accurate betting advice here, but it does look, I think the teams so far, the standout teams are South Africa and France. I haven't looked to see how the draw works, whether that could even be a final. I don't know if they meet beforehand. New Zealand looks slightly off the boil, as do Australia. England, I think, to be frank, would be lucky to make it to the last eight. Of the British teams, if we put it like that, or the British Isles teams, Ireland, I think, is easily the strongest. Obviously, they're not a British team. The Irish team is a strong team, but I think England, Scotland, and Wales will also round. So
that's been good. The coverage actually here in the States has been good. It's quite interesting that the U.S. can't mount a team and get into the Rugby World Cup, but no, it's an exciting sport. It's great to watch.
It's very much a minority sport in the US, though, isn't it? I mean, people don't kind of play it at school and college much. So.
Well, there's like college rugby, right? There's not really, and there's a professional league, but it's very nascent. I don't know. I mean, American football just dominates everything, but it's hard to believe we couldn't, like most things in America, we're always like, why can't we find 11 or 20 people that can do this well, including play proper soccer. Anyways, but no, it's great to watch. It's a fun sport, and um, the speed, the athleticism. I don't know. It's an exciting game to watch. Much more fast paced than American football for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you haven't got the endless ad breaks, which is
Wow, come on, man. Capitalism.
yeah, no, but they changed the rules of the game, so you could have more
What
ad.
comes first? What comes first, the
Yeah.
game or the capitalism? Anyways,
Anyhow, what I'm reading, having
you don't like to
inflicted.
watch. You don't like to watch 4-hour sporting events filled with 2 hours of adverts. Come on.
Well, I wouldn't even watch 4 hours of the Tour de France, to be honest. I might watch an hour or two when it's the mountainous stage.
Well, you're too busy. You're too demanding. Too many
Yeah,
prime ministers calling you. You don't have time
yeah,
for that.
whatever.
Anyways,
I'm waiting for that call from the Tony Blair Institute. I may have
you
a
want to
long.
be eight. Yeah, you want to be 801.
I will a long way. Now, having inflicted lots of huge, great, thick, serious books on people, it's time for a slim one. A big relief all round. And it's called, it's about 30 years old. And this, again, I think had been a Christmas present about 30 years ago. And you kind of look at it and you think, oh, yeah, I must get around to doing some of that. And then, of course, you don't. And then I thought, let's try and find something a bit lighter for this show. And I sort of lighted on this book. Cocktails and mixed drinks. All you need to know to be what they describe here as the home bartender.
Love
So,
it.
and I think, from memory, it was written in 1982, and it's my sort of book. It's a page with a picture of the drink, if I can find one somewhere. Here we go, and then how you make it, basically. Yeah. So, for example, what is that one? There's a gin-based one, so they're kind of very in at the moment. But it is pretty much 200 different cocktails, and if I don't turn up for a few shows, I've been taking the book far too seriously. But it's quite a fun book, and I think you'll put a link to it in the notes. And it's always useful to be able to make a cocktail.
I agree, man. There's nothing better than a good cocktail and having a skill set to, concoct a few for your friends and family. It's a good
Yeah.
skill. I love it.
So, what are you up to?
This is an old book I'm bringing back because it's very timely. Daniel Yergin, who wrote the book Power about oil. This is the new map. This is much more around commodities, similar to Ed Conway's book. But it's energy, climate, and the clash of nations. I think it's very timely, super important. Commodities, energy, it's all coming together. There's this new corridor, this India, Middle East, Europe corridor, which is all about shipping, obviously minerals and whatnot. Good book
And
to read.
he's the big man, isn't he? I remember him for writing the sort of definitive work on the world oil industry. And
yeah, exactly. Like I think the book is called Power or Oil. Yeah, it's all. But he's an energy consultant and power. It's very similar in that. I think if you've been paying attention, frankly, you may know this stuff. But if you're looking for a quick read about what you should be paying attention to and why energy matters and the geopolitics around it, good book. I watched this on Netflix. I don't know if it was the last few weeks, but there's a 3-part episode, a documentary, Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's called Arnold. It's about himself as an athlete, an actor, as an American. Quite an interesting character. He's a global influencer. Hell of a story. Comes from a small Austrian town, literally in the middle of nowhere, and rises to this amazing prominence. Married to a Kennedy, governor of California, huge box office star, etc. I don't know, hell of a story. And it's a retrospective. It's an interesting story and, light, easy watch and kind of fun to see his transition throughout his life and just the fortitude and taking on these different pursuits.
It's only the US Constitution that's stopping him from running for president, I guess.
You have to be born in United States territory. So it's interesting when John McCain, his dad was an admiral in the Navy, and he was actually born on a Navy base. So there was some foreign Navy base, I think in Panama. So there was dispute, like, was he actually born in America? And he was born in American territory. So yeah, that's what's holding him back. Anybody can become an American, but only the president has to be an American citizen, but also born in the territory. So I don't know. I think we probably should change that law. Do you have a similar? Do you have a
No,
birthplace requirement?
No, we don't have, and no, everything is very loose in England, as we discussed before. You don't have to be a cabinet minister. You don't have to be an MP. King Charles could ring up his favourite, you know, hairdresser and say, "Would you like to be prime minister?" The only thing you have to be able to do is command a majority in the House of Commons, and one presumes that Prince Charles's hairdresser wouldn't be able to command that majority. But in theory, it's an incredibly loose system. Um, and again, like a lot of things in Britain, it's not particularly written down anywhere, other than it's just done by precedent and what's thought to have been good past practice. So there's certainly no birth requirement. There
You
used to
could
be religious
go ahead.
requirements. There used to be religious requirements until the 1820s, 1830s. Roman Catholics, I don't think they could even stand as MPs or, for that matter, vote. There's something called the Roman Catholic Emancipation Act. Um, and then, of course, people say, "Oh, well, we had a very early Jewish prime minister with Benjamin Disraeli." In fact, there's kind of a hint in the surname there, Disraeli. But in fact, he was. I think his parents were Christian converts, so I think he was actually born a Christian. Well, he certainly was a Christian by the time he became prime minister in the 1870s. But actually, the criteria are kind of very loose. I mean, Monsieur Macron could have a go should he wish to.
I think, yeah, I could see, like, our Constitution was written in 1787, ratified 1788. So you could see, obviously just coming out of the War of Independence, and you could see why they'd want a real American to be president.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it seems to be a very antiquated law that should be changed. And I don't know. Seems like there's a lot of talent in the world.
And of course, America, we kind of forget this, don't we? America was only, what, the 13 initial states.
Yeah.
Didn't even get us, just about got to the Mississippi. The border
Yeah.
with Canada hadn't really been fully resolved one way or another. Florida was still part of the sort of French
Spain.
Empire, or Spain, and you had
Yeah.
Louisiana. Again, a hint in the name, Louisiana, King Louis, and all the rest of it. So, yeah, it was written for a very different age, really, wasn't it?
Yes, that's what. Yeah, I could go through other amendments. The Second Amendment, particularly the right to bear arms, which makes sense when you're, a rebel
Yeah, but
insurgency.
we're
But
on
I
thin
don't know.
ice here, and I'm particularly on thin ice. But I think a number of people who quote this tend to only quote one half of the sentence. But that's if you read the full sentence, it's bear arms for a particular reason rather than just going around, shooting one another.
Correct. That's the beauty of a constitution, man. It's whatever, it's whatever you want it to be. It's all about
Well, no,
interpretation.
but what it's done is created a huge industry for lawyers. I think it's one of the reasons there's so many lawyers in America, because there's so many points of law to argue over.
Well, it's very litigious. And the other, I think, interesting aspect of America is, like, you have these kind of guidelines, but you can add and change laws whenever you want. So,
Yeah.
anyways,
Well, maybe Arnie will appear. What if both candidates, and one shouldn't say this lightheartedly, but both candidates don't make it to the 2024 election, or incapable or whatever? Could this be time to call for Arnie?
let's see. I don't know if is he old enough. Oh, he's 76, so it's perfect. He's just perfect. It's amazing, all these 70-year-olds just lingering around.
They're all living far too long.
It's really amazing. Anyways, all right. That's all we got for today. Thanks, everybody. Ructions, Marc Ross, Gerald Ashley. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time to inflict more insight, more damage, more knowledge to make the world a better place.
See you then. Bye-bye.